Welcome back to NewsWire here on SportsGrid. One of the bigger fines levied out against a sports book, or I should say on a sports book, just happened recently. We're going to dive into this with Pat Evans from Legal Sports Report. This is not like a five-figure fine or anything like that, but first we will hit on the very latest with PrizePicks. Hey, Pat, thanks for coming on the show once again today. Good to see you again. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, hey, Craig. Thanks for having me on twice in 1 week while all my colleagues are off enjoying a vacation. So, you know what?
Double the pay, Pat. You just take it anytime you can. That's what I would say. All right,
yeah, I get paid the big bucks for coming on here.
There it is, huge bucks. So let's start off with PrizePicks. Very up and down year for them, and a lot of these other very specific sports betting operators, some of the peer-to-peer gaming companies. It's a wild year for them. Maybe when you recap the year, you'll talk about that. But Adam Wexler, no question, initially when PrizePicks launched and really got to that next level, he's responsible, I'm guessing, for a lot of that. But he has decided to step down as CEO. And so maybe more so, I would ask, Pat, how do we interpret this? Is this something that would speak to more of the future as the crackdown has come in on some of these peer-to-peer gaming sites?
It does come at a curious time, but not necessarily because of that. Because, yes, you're right. They've had a crazy year and a half or so of regulatory scrutiny coming down at these DFS 2.0 or DFS plus operators, however you want to describe them, that they offer essentially a parlay bet-like product that kind of has been able to get around a lot of rules and regulations. And some regulators have said, whoa, hold on, that's too close. And of course, now we've talked about that in the past. But what's really interesting about this decision at this point is Wexler, as you noted, is an entrepreneur at heart. He's started a few DFS companies and certainly has an eye for this kind of industry and getting things going and off the ground. And I think he's seen the point where, okay, PrizePicks is this pretty big monster now out there, even with some of the scrutiny that's been put on it. And there's lots of opportunity in front of it, which is why they've just hired a firm to kind of look at mergers and acquisitions. And Bloomberg reported that they're not looking for an outright sale. So as Wexler kind of says, okay, I'm going to step aside, become the executive chairman. They're going to bring in Mike Ibarra, who is a seasoned exec. He comes from the video game developer Blizzard, which has done Warcraft and StarCraft. If you're a gamer of any sort, he also has 20 years at Microsoft, where he was a vice president in the Windows and Xbox divisions. So he's got lots of experience, lots of managerial and probably foresight, and however you want to talk about it. And he's coming in just as they're starting to talk about mergers and acquisitions. Now, what does that mean? That's to be determined. We'll see what kind of thing happens. There's been floated ideas that somebody might come in and take a big chunk of it and help them grow even more. There's been ideas floated that maybe they'll purchase a small sports book and use their large database that they've built up in some of these states that haven't legalized sports betting yet, including California, Texas, and Georgia. They've got, they're headquartered in Georgia, so that's a big home state for them. And so there's lots of opportunity there. And I think Wexler probably said, you know what, I got it off the ground. I've got it to a really good place. I can still help guide it from a chairman position and kind of work with our new CEO to find where these new, expansion opportunities are. And we'll see where it goes. I mean, again, there's big opportunity in Texas and California for anybody who has a decent sized database. So if they can figure out how to transform that once those go live, though, this is just kind of an aside. I was talking to a former industry executive who's now in consulting, and he said, I've told clients, wait till 2030 for Texas and California, or don't budget anything for them. So those two states, as we've talked about many times on this show, whether it was me or any of my colleagues, those two states are just a very complicated mess. But PrizePicks is still trying to figure out its way forward. And they are, by far the biggest DFS company at this point and making their way forward. So, just an interesting executive switch at an interesting time as they're looking at mergers and acquisitions and have developed into a industry stalwart and trying to figure out their next steps.
Yeah, and I know you'll cover that for us. Another story that you've covered recently is this huge number that was levied out in terms of fines to Bet365. The number, $500,000 in fines for odds over a 3-year period. Okay, so I'm going to need to understand, Pat, a little bit more about this. Did Bet365 charge odds to customers for 3 years? Is that what went on here? What exactly is this?
It was across, I think, 13 events or something like that over the 3 years, and they're being ordered to repay customers or refund customers for paying out at worse odds than those customers ended up buying in or betting. They saw or they noticed that there were bad odds up on the board, and they corrected them. Now, what normally needs to happen, according to the New York gaming regulators, is you have to go back to the regulators and say, we need to do this and get approval for it. Well, they didn't do that. They went around it and let the customers kind of float on, and then they paid out the odds, the worse odds. So they're just being told to refund those bets. And I think that's just a good sign that regulators are paying attention, that customers are getting, not getting shafted. And again, that's one of the good things about a legal regulated market is, you're making sure the customer is getting rewarded appropriately. If that was an offshore operator, they would have gotten away with that. Now, did Bet365 do this on purpose? It does not appear that way. I don't think that was their intention. I think they just noticed a bad set of odds for any of these events on the board and said, well, we got to fix that. And, things got lost in the shuffle at that point. So just kind of the regulatory market working as it's supposed to, in short.
Yeah, no, it is. All right, fair enough. Let's end with this story here in Maryland. Story about online casino betting. Not so much about the actual betting that's going on, Pat, but about what a lot of these companies seem to be doing, and I know you've been reporting on this, is like internal reviews as to how they have handled legalization of going online and their rollouts. And so what did we learn, or what did the legislatures learn from their rollout in Maryland?
Yeah, so we were at a conference, pretty much the whole team and myself in Pittsburgh last month, with legislators from gaming states. It's literally called the National Council of Legislators from Gaming States. And, there was quite a bit of talk about online casino legislation. I mean, this is where, the money, the revenue is going to come for most of these operators in the future, way more so than sports betting. Now that we have 38 plus states legalized, they're turning their attention to this. Maryland was probably the closest to getting it done last year, and Senator Ron Watson was by far the most insightful thing we saw at this conference, because he got up in a fireside chat and kind of laid out what happened. Basically, he said, that legislators need to treat this rather than a piece of legislation, which granted it is. They need to treat it like running a full campaign, because there is a lot of education that needs to happen around this and why it's important to regulate it, kind of like we were just talking with in New Jersey and sports betting. So basically, he just said, you got to get it around. You've got to get the education out there, because things like the cannibalization argument that came out in Maryland in big force killed the issue, because there was a casino that came out and said, this is going to hurt us. The union of workers showed up en masse to one of the hearings, and that, legislators see that and it dies. So basically, he's like, you just have to run it like a campaign. You've got to get a whole team behind it to educate legislators and the public on why this is important and why it's good for the public. So it'll be interesting to see if anybody uses that lesson going into the next session.
All right. Well, Pat, twice this week, twice the fun, twice the information. You can even get more of it over at LegalSportsReport.com. Thanks again, Pat, for coming on the show.
Thanks, Craig. I'll see you next week.